Do you want to stand at the front lines to protect your allies or blind your enemies into submission? Or maybe you're tired of being a good guy that everyone takes advantage of and you want to cut everything down with a lawnmower. Then maybe you want to play the Cleric class in Baldur's Gate 3. Any balanced team composition has a support in it, and Cleric is generally the best option for this because of their buffs like Bless to allow your allies to land their attacks, healing to keep them alive so that your allies can enjoy the full extent of their builds, and plenty of access to holy damage, which is very potent against undead, which you can find a lot of in this game. So if you're ready to put your team on your back, here's a full guide to the Cleric for Baldur's Gate 3 Tactician mode, including leveling progression choices, items to watch out for, and my favorite build to play on Cleric, which lets you tank for your team while being a supportive caster that can also dish out good damage, meaning you can basically do everything. Clerics can by default use medium armor and shields, but can only use one-handed weapons, so you can easily get plenty of armor class to become very tanky. Healing is not very efficient in Baldur's Gate 3 because damage happens so much faster and with no limits, so focusing only on healing isn't very effective. But you can protect your allies to reduce that damage by using the Radiating Orb mechanic that lowers enemies' chance to hit with attack rolls, which you can get from certain items that I'll show how to get later on. If you can't get these items, the build is much less effective, but if you do, then we can use pulsing AoE spells like Spirit Guardians, which we learn by level 5, to reach full synergy. You don't need to wait till level 12 when the game is already over to start having fun. Most players will use Shadowheart as their Cleric because she's an origin character that will give you much more story if you do so, and this is completely fine and recommended. But if you want to optimize your race and class combination on a custom character, there are some options. Because we will get extremely high chance to dodge attacks with armor class, our weakest point in this build is actually magical damage, so the best race options for the build I suggest are racials that give resistance to magic damage, like the Tiefling or specific types of Dragonborn. Fire resistance is the best to go for, because we'll actually be using some fire spells ourselves, and we might get caught in the collateral damage. Otherwise, you can go for any kind of elf for resistance to sleep, which can interrupt our powerful concentration spells. Concentrations are also interrupted whenever you take damage and fail the Constitution saving throw. This means we want to have our Constitution stat as high as possible, but Wisdom is still our main stat, so starting with 17 Wisdom and 16 in Concentration works best. Then you can go 14 in Dexterity if you really want to deplete every other stat, but you can balance them out more evenly if you really want to. We also want to choose a Light Cleric. Shadowheart starts as a Trickery Cleric, but that isn't so great, so if possible you should re-roll her to a Light Cleric as soon as possible. Light Clerics have so much more reliable protection for their team later on through the Warding Flare. This can be used as a reaction to give disadvantage to an attack. The reason why this is so powerful is because you can decide to give a disadvantage to an attack after the attack roll has already been confirmed. So it's more like you get to re-roll an attack that should have hit you, and later on you can use this to protect your allies with the same effect. Leveling as a cleric does not provide many choices. You generally just collect new spells for your arsenal, but you must decide which spells to use at any given time by which ones you've prepared. So at level 1, clerics have some decent spells like Guiding Bolt, which does a lot of damage early on and gives advantage to the next attack roll against that target if the Guiding Bolt hits. Bless gives higher attack rolls to your party, and Fairy Fire can be used to give advantage to allies that hit the enemy that you debuff with Fairy Fire. All of these spells are super great early on when your party hasn't scaled up their hit chance yet. Sanctuary is also a very powerful spell because it only costs a level 1 spell slot, but its effect scales up even into the very end of the game. Essentially, enemies cannot target you when you have Sanctuary, and Sanctuary ends if you attack an enemy. Enemies can still hit you with collateral damage or spells that don't need a target, but for the most part, having Sanctuary on you is a massive safety net, and it costs a bonus action, making it very versatile. You can also do many things while you have Sanctuary on you, like body block enemies from reaching your allies, summoning other entities which will attack enemies for you, or just healing allies when they go down. None of these actions will remove your Sanctuary, but be careful with lingering fire fields because they can still count as an attack. You will run out of spell slots early on though, so most of the time you might be spamming Sacred Flame, which is the damaging cantrip for clerics. This cantrip is not very good because it misses most of the time, has a very low base difficulty rating, and it uses the enemy dexterity to give bonuses to their roll, which is very easily one of the most common stats. So clerics might feel really weak when they're out of spell slots, which is why you'll want to rest often or use those spell slots to invest in supporting your allies. At level 2, we'll get our Channel Divinity charges, which we can use to turn undead and make them flee, or as a light cleric, we get to use the Radiance spell. This just does a wide-ranged holy attack that will even do half damage if the enemy avoids it with a saving throw. So it's just a very reliable damage, and Channel Divinity charges refresh on short rests, so make sure to use them. At level 3, we'll get more spell slots and level 2 spells. The most notable ones here are Enhance Ability, which is great for succeeding dialogue and skill checks all throughout the game, and Spiritual Weapon, which isn't amazing later on, but at level 3 it'll help us out at least until we can get our more powerful spells in a few more levels. Level 4 allows us to get a new cantrip, Take Resistance, which isn't great. Mainly though, we get a feat and we want to go for Warcaster. This gives advantage on concentration saving throws so that we can upkeep concentrations much more easily even while taking damage on the front lines. If you lose your concentration, you have to recast them, which is going to tax you of your spell slots. Enemies will also take concentrations into account when choosing which target to attack, and this means that always having up Bless or Fairy Fire will make you more likely to be attacked, thus drawing the attention away from your allies onto yourself, allowing you to more effectively tank. Be careful though, don't overwrite your concentrations as you can only have one up at a time. You also get to shock enemies as a reaction, but this competes with your Warding Flare, which also uses a reaction, so pass on this if you want to be more defensive and save that reaction to dodge an extra attack. At level 5 we get plenty of level 3 spells, and our Turn Undead will also deal damage now, but generally the Radiance skill is going to be more effective. As a light cleric, we get Fireball, which is one of the best burst spells, but we mostly want to be using our spell slots on Spirit Guardians. This is a concentration that creates an area around you for 10 turns, dealing holy or necrotic damage to enemies that are in that area. We want to always use the holy version of this spell because it will synergize with the equipment I'm going to suggest you get. And about now is when you can start getting these items. Not all of this gear is mandatory, but the more you get, the better the synergy or the faster that you get it. So the first item we want is the Luminous Armor, which you can find in a chest off to the side by the Sigil and the Selûnite outpost in the Underdark. This creates a radiant shockwave around you when you deal holy damage, and this applies Radiating Orbs to enemies near you. Radiating Orb reduces their attack rolls, and the effect stacks higher the more turns they have left on this debuff. So when using Spirit Guardians and hitting multiple enemies around you, they all trigger a Radiant Shockwave, which gives each of them Radiating Orb stacks. This can easily stack up to 10 when there are multiple enemies adjacent to each other, making it almost impossible for them to hit you or your allies, allowing you to effectively support them and to survive while standing in the middle of a battle. And if you want to maximize how many hits of Spirit Guardians you get, you want to manage your positioning very carefully. It can only pulse once per turn, meaning if you stay next to someone, it will hit them at the beginning of your turn. However, exiting and re-entering range can allow more hits in between your turns. For example, if you move into range to hit them, then move out of range, then they move into range and take more damage on their turn, you've hit them twice per your turn by moving in and out of range. A bit of a ways outside the outpost, there is a sword and a stone. Falar Aluve. If you can manage to pull it out, it's a finesse sword, which means it can work well with dexterity and has 2 spells it can cast. One is basically a bless on nearby allies for 5 turns, or the other option is enemies will take extra damage while in range. So combined with Spirit Guardians, you can do some heavy damage over time, or you can give your allies a double bless if you precast these and then go in. In the Myconid colony, a bit further into the Underdark, you can find a Mind Flayer who will give you a quest to retrieve some mushrooms from the Wizard Tower. Once you finish that quest, they will allow you to trade with them and you can buy the Boots of Stormy Clamor. They apply reverberations whenever you apply another condition, and Radiating Orb is a condition, so you can apply tons of reverberation as well, which reduces their strength, dexterity, and constitution saving throws, and at 5 stacks of reverberations will deal damage and have a chance to knock them down, which further protects you and your allies. In Act 2, there are some more Radiating Orb items you shouldn't miss out on. In the basement of the Last Light Inn, there's a hidden passage behind some boxes in a cell. In the chest, there's a coruscation ring which will give more radiating orbs when hitting enemies with spell damage, while in a light source, which your radiating orbs will provide you with. Then after you fight the measles a bit away from the Last Light Inn, you can open the chest on the ledge for the luminous gloves, which gives you more radiating orb stacks to targets hit by radiant damage. If you have all these items, you can basically solo most fights in the game as long as you have good positioning and lure enemies together to stack up your radiating orbs. Though you will still be vulnerable to archers who attack you from range or spellcasters. That's why you want a good shield and medium armor to get your armor class to at least 20. We'll want to get our wisdom and dexterity stats up next because those are the most common saving throws when facing spellcasters. So at level 6, we get improved Warding Flare, which allows you to Warding Flare when an ally gets hit to protect them. Save your reactions for this. Level 7 gives us level 4 spell slots and some of the most powerful spells in the game. Guardian of Faith is a summon that can't move but will attack enemies that come close or those that attack allies within its range. It's great value because it does a lot of damage for one level 4 spell slot and it has some area control to it, and it can be used while in Sanctuary. Light Domain Clerics will also get Wall of Fire, which is nice too for spreading your damage out further, but it's a concentration which competes with Spirit Guardians, which is at this point our bread and butter. Level 8 gives Light Clerics potent spellcasting, which adds more of our wisdom to cleric cantrips. So basically Sacred Flame gets a big buff to make it feel a lot better. Also we get a feat which we want to raise our wisdom with. The only real way to get more wisdom is either the increased stats feat or the resilient feat, in which you would pick wisdom. It doesn't really matter which one you pick here because we'll go for both eventually, and since we're at 17, the extra 1 wisdom from resilient gets us to the 18 stat cutoff, so I just go for resilient for the extra saving throw advantage. At this point the game becomes a lot easier and power creep sets in, so you can choose whatever path you want for multi-classing. You can keep going into Cleric until level 12 if you want to lean more into support, since you'll get some very powerful level 5 and 6 spells that can heal your allies for a lot. Or summon Divas, which are almost as powerful as an entire character. However, there are some things that don't quite feel great, such as the level 10 skill, Divine Intervention. It's a cool flavor skill, but at the end of the day, if you can only use a spell once per playthrough, are you really using that spell at all? Another option is to go for a Monk Multiclass here. Their main stat is also Wisdom, and you can use key points to do extra dashes and disengages with your bonus actions, and also infinitely jump when using these abilities, so that you can move much further each turn and spread out your radiating orbs to as many enemies as possible. Or you can use Void Bulbs to pull everything in together and then nuke them and your eyes by walking into the clutter. At level 11 or Monk level 3, you can choose the Way of the Elements subclass. This will give you more ki regeneration out of combat and will also allow you to learn some interesting spells. Ultimately, it's up to you what you pick, but I like the Thunder Wave, the Block of Ice, and the Pole Whip, because these can further help me control the battlefield with positioning and peeling enemies off of my allies. At level 12, you get the other feat that gives you more wisdom, so we'll be sitting at 20 wisdom, which is a good amount to boost your spells. So now you're an immortal cleric that can protect your allies and smite your enemies. It does rely on a mechanic that is very overperforming, so if you don't like abusing the most powerful stuff, you can minimize how many radiating orbs you can apply by just using different gear. Later on, you'll probably want to replace it anyways, but even if the radiating orb interaction does get nerfed, this build should still be one of the best ways to get this playstyle, and I'll be using it for sure when I want a cleric in my future runs. But if you would like to see future Baldur's Gate 3 videos from me, then please subscribe, and if this content was helpful, like this video and support me by clicking the links in the description. Suggest to me what other classes or builds you'd like to see covered in the comments, and I'll see you all next time.